Hi, I'm the history guy. I have a degree in history. I love history. If you love history too, this is the channel for you. April 3rd of 1944, the United States Supreme Court struck down a Texas state law that allowed the Texas Democratic Party to set its own internal rules, including excluding non-whites from membership in the party and therefore excluding non-whites from the right to vote in the Democratic primary. This decision was significant for a number of reasons, not the least of which was that it had a clear and larger immediate effect than some much better known civil rights decisions of the day. And understanding why this decision had such a large effect helps us to understand that interaction between culture, the courts, and legislation that helps us understand these landmark Supreme Court decisions and how much effect they really have on how the country is governed. And so today we're going to try to put some context around the landmark Supreme Court decision, Smith versus Allwright. The Texas State Democratic Party had decided in their convention to restrict membership in the Democratic Party and therefore participation in the Democratic primary election only to white voters. As the Democratic Party in Texas had pretty much pushed out the Republicans, that meant that the only relevant election decisions in Texas excluded non-white voters. Lonnie Smith, a black dentist from Houston, sued county official S.S. Allwright for the right to vote in the primary. Smith was represented by legendary civil rights attorney Thurgood Marshall, who would go on to argue the landmark case Brown versus the Board of Education, and then would be appointed to the United States Supreme Court, America's first black U.S. Supreme Court justice. In an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court decided that the state of Texas had violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution when the state delegated its authority to the Democratic Party to regulate their own primaries, thus allowing the practice of discrimination. In effect, though not necessarily in text, what the decision did was affirm the universal right to vote in all elections, including party primaries, and not be excluded based on race. While this may seem like common sense today, at the time it was rather a controversial judicial decision. Just 9 years earlier, the Supreme Court had unanimously ruled in the case Grovey versus Townsend that the parties as private organizations had the right to set their own rules, and the court had distinguished between discrimination by private organizations and discrimination by the state. In deciding that the state could not circumvent the 14th Amendment by delegating responsibilities to a private organization, Smith versus Allwright directly overruled the decision in Grovey versus Townsend. Even more startling was that the court did not argue that there was a change in situation or a change in facts. The court specifically argued that the decision in Grovey versus Townsend was incorrect and overruled. The shift from a 9-0 decision in 1935 to being overruled by an 8-1 decision just 9 years later is unprecedented in U.S. Supreme Court history. But almost as unprecedented was the immediate effect that the court decision had. In 1940, just 3% of eligible black voters in the Deep South were registered to vote. By 1952, that was over 20%. In 1944, there were just 200,000 black voters registered in the South. By 1948, that was 700,000 to 800,000, and the number was over 1 million by 1952. Scholar Darlene Clark Hines argued that Smith versus Allwright was a watershed in the movement for black rights, the beginning of the Second Reconstruction and the modern civil rights movement. All of the advances in civil rights in the succeeding decades, she argued, would have been impossible without striking down the white primary. Thurgood Marshall agreed, arguing that the case was a giant milestone in the progress of Negro Americans towards full citizenship. This is somewhat of a surprise since the decision itself was somewhat limited in scope, but the immediate and measurable effect of Smith versus Allwright was actually much larger than the better-known civil rights decisions of the era in Norris versus Alabama and Brown versus Board of Education. Law professor Michael Klarman, writing in the Florida State University Law Review in the fall of 2001, argued that there were several specific reasons why the decision in Smith versus Allwright had a uniquely large immediate impact. Among those, the whites in the South had softened their attitude towards black suffrage, even though they still had strong attitudes towards school segregation. that for various reasons, blacks in the South were better able to take advantage of the decision and were more empowered to challenge local ordinances in the courts of law. And finally, lower courts, tired of states trying to circumvent the 14th Amendment through shenanigans, were more willing to take an expansive view of the Smith decision that it turned it into a de facto guarantee of the right to vote in party primaries. In short, a confluence of different social factors worked together to give the decision a much larger impact than it otherwise might have had. The conclusion is that the Supreme Court has actually a rather limited ability to change national attitudes, but a well-timed court decision can be a significant driving force. It is important to note that Smith versus Allwright did not mark an end to racial discrimination in the United States. Thurgood Marshall noted that despite fond hopes, the decision did not put an end to the fight for black voting rights. Even in 1952, when black voter registration in the South had jumped from 3% to 20%, that still meant that the vast majority of black Americans were still not registered to vote in the South, and they still faced institutional obstacles and determined, often violent, opposition. And yet this decision had an enormous, almost outsized impact, and that begs the question. What happened in the 9 years between Grovey versus Townsend and Smith versus Allwright? Well, there were a lot of things that changed in America at the time, but by far the single biggest thing that happened during that period was the Second World War. The United States was at war with an evil fascist regime that believed in Aryan racial supremacy. We saw ourselves as fighting for democracy, for freedom against the fascists. And that meant that we started to want to live up to our own ideals. In facing that evil, we came up with a desire to address the evil in ourselves. And these barriers to blacks voting made even less sense when black Americans were overseas dying for that same cause. And that brings us to the strangest irony of all, because the same court that made the decision in Smith versus Allwright made the despicable decision in Korematsu versus the United States to uphold the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. Considered one of the worst Supreme Court decisions of all time, it was described by legal scholar Bruce Fain as an odious and discredited artifact of popular bigotry. And that's the irony, the same social force that drove the impact of Smith versus Allwright drove the bigotry of Korematsu versus the United States. So it seems in the end that the Supreme Court is still a creature of their time, that they cannot save the nation from themselves. The real lesson is that true and lasting change has to occur in the hearts of the people. I'm the History Guy. Hope you enjoyed this edition of my channel, 5 Minutes of History, short snippets of forgotten history, 5 to 10 minutes long. If you did enjoy it, then go ahead and click that thumbs up button that you see on your left. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to write those in the comment section. I would be happy to respond. And if you'd like to get 5 more minutes of forgotten history, all you have to do is click the subscribe button on your right.